Your hands are numb inside the leather gloves, lined with wool that the quartermaster issued you 6 hours ago in the equipment room. Gloves that were supposed to protect you from the 43 degrees below zero that reign at an altitude of 7,600 meters above the surface of Europe, but that in reality only delay the inevitable, which is the progressive loss of sensation in your fingers. First a tingling, then a dull numbness, then nothing, and that nothing is what you feel right now, as your hands rest on the lateral controls of the Norden Mark 15 bomb sight, a device weighing 22 kilograms, 64 centimeters long, with 2,000 mechanical parts assembled, with a precision that the United States Army Air Corps considers as valuable as the life of any crew member, perhaps more so, because bombardiers can be replaced. But the Norden sight you guard under oath. You cover it with a canvas shroud every time you land. You destroy it with a thermite. Charge before it falls into enemy hands if you are shot down. And every night, during the briefings, an intelligence officer with the face of a high school teacher reminds you that revealing any detail about its operation constitutes treason punishable by court-martial and execution, as if you needed to be threatened with death when death already travels with you aboard this Boeing B-17G flying fortress that shakes with every gust of turbulence like a school bus rattling down a stone road. An aircraft with a 22-meter wingspan and 18 metric tons of empty weight that the crew calls the Confessor, because they say that inside it, every man confesses what he truly is. The brave become brave, and the coward becomes coward, and you still do not know what you are. Because you have flown only 4 missions of the 25, you need to complete your combat tour and go home. 25 missions that sound like a manageable number until someone, usually the tail gunner over his third warm beer at the village pub, tells you that the 8th Air Force statistics indicate only 1 in 4 crewmen completes the tour, which means that of the 10 men who make up the Confessor's crew, statistically, only 2 or 3 will see American soil again. And you look around the cabin pressurized only with cold and fear, and you wonder which 2, which 3, and whether you are among them, or whether you are already a dead man breathing, a corpse with a watch that still marks the hours, but whose final hour has already been decided by some 18-year-old German anti-aircraft gunner, who at this very moment is calibrating the proximity fuse of an 88mm shell somewhere beneath the clouds covering the Ruhr Basin. You are 23 years old. 14 months ago, you were 21, and sitting on the porch of a white wooden house in Decatur, Illinois, reading a letter from the Selective Service informing you, with the bureaucratic courtesy that only the federal government can administer, that you had been classified 1A and were to report to the Macon County Draft Board within 14 days. You did not feel fear. You felt something more diffuse and more dangerous. You felt relief. Because you were 21, and you worked packing boxes at a corn processing plant 6 days a week for $32, and you lived with your widowed mother in a house that was falling apart and that smelled of dampness, and the cheap cologne of your dead father that she kept spraying on the pillows as if the scent could substitute for the man. And your girlfriend Ruth Ann had left you 3 months earlier for an insurance salesman from Springfield who had his own car and a full set of teeth. And the war, that war you heard on the radio and saw in the newsreels at the cinema on Saturdays, seemed at least like a direction, a place to go when the place where you are is nowhere. You did not enlist out of patriotism, although that is what you wrote on the form. You enlisted because the alternative was staying in Decatur, packing corn until your hands cracked like your father's, and your soul shrank until it fit inside a cardboard box like the ones you hauled every shift. The Air Corps recruiter looked at your hands, gave you a hand-eye coordination test and a mathematics test, and when he saw that you could calculate angles and solve second-degree equations with a speed that surprised even him, he told you that you had the profile for a bombardier. Not bombardier as in the airplane, bombardier as in the man who operates the sight, the one who calculates wind speed, altitude, ground speed, lateral drift, the one who adjusts the controls and presses the button, and releases the bombs that fall for 38 seconds from 7,000 meters, until they turn a point on a map into a smoking crater, where before there had been a factory or a railway marshalling yard, or, on the bad days, a neighborhood of houses with slate roofs where people ate black bread and plum jam for breakfast before you erased the breakfast, the house, and the life with 500 kilograms of Composition B high explosive. They trained you at Victorville, California, a base in the Mojave Desert where the heat reached 47 degrees in summer, and where you learned to operate the Norden site with the liturgical devotion of a seminarian learning to celebrate Mass. The site was your altar and your weapon. A stabilized gyroscope that compensated for the aircraft's movements, a 20-power telescope, a mechanical analog computer composed of gears, cams, and disks that solved in real time the ballistic equation of the bombing run. You calculated the bomb's angle of fall by integrating the true altitude corrected for barometric pressure, the indicated airspeed minus the crosswind component, the aerodynamic drag of the ordnance according to its ballistic coefficient, and the result was a point in the telescope's reticle that you called the index of impact point, and when that point coincided with the target on the ground, an electromagnetic mechanism released the shackles of the bomb rack and the payload fell. And in that instant, for a fraction of a second that lasted an eternity, you were simultaneously a mathematician, a craftsman, and an executioner. On the Victorville practice range, you dropped cement bombs on targets painted in the desert, and they graded you by the distance between impact and the center of the target, what they called circular error probable, and your average CEP was 46 meters, nearly half the squadron average, which made you the best bombardier in your class, a title the instructor, a first lieutenant from Oklahoma with a burn scar on his right forearm that he never explained, celebrated by buying you a beer and telling you with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "Congratulations, son. You are an artist of destruction." You did not understand what he meant until you crossed the Atlantic. You arrived at the base at Thorpe Abbotts in the county of Norfolk, England, in January of 1944. The airfield was a rectangle of concrete and mud surrounded by green meadows where cows grazed with a total indifference toward the 4 Wright Cyclone engines of 1,200 horsepower each that roared every morning at 5:30 when the B-17S of the 100th Bombardment Group lined up on the runway, like gray elephants preparing for a migration that not all of them would complete. The quarters were a Nissen hut of corrugated sheet metal with a coal stove that heated a radius of 2 meters and left the rest of the space at the mercy of the English winter. A winter that was not cold, like the one in Illinois, but damp. A cold that seeped into your bones, like water filtering through the cracks of an old wall, and that would not leave even with 3 blankets or with the Scotch whiskey the navigator bought in the village for 3 shillings a bottle. Your crew was composed of 10 men who 2 months ago were strangers and who were now the closest thing to a family you had 8,000 kilometers from home. The pilot, Lieutenant Harry Brennan from Boston, an Irish Catholic of 26 with steady hands and the habit of reciting the Hail Mary in Latin during takeoff. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James DeWitt from Savannah, Georgia, a quiet man who read Hemingway and never talked about his life before the war. The navigator, Lieutenant Morris Rabinowitz from Brooklyn, a 24-year-old Jewish New Yorker with round spectacles and a sense of humor as black as the flak that awaited us over Germany, who said that if Hitler knew a Jew was sending him bombs by registered mail, he would die of irony before the shrapnel got him. The flight engineer and top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant Bill Kowalski from Pittsburgh, a Pole who stood 1.93 meters and could disassemble and reassemble a Browning .50 caliber machine gun in 52 seconds with his eyes closed. The radio operator, Sergeant Pete Callahan from San Francisco, who played the clarinet and kept in the pocket of his flight jacket a photograph of a red-haired girl named Dottie, to whom he had proposed marriage in a letter we were never sure he had actually sent. The 2 waist gunners, Corporals Tommy Driscoll and Arthur Pena, the first from Minnesota and the second from New Mexico, inseparable as twins though they looked nothing alike. The tail gunner, Corporal Ray Henderson from Alabama, a thin and silent man who shot with a supernatural accuracy and who said he had learned to shoot hunting squirrels at the age of 8. And the ball turret gunner, Corporal Lester Novak from Nebraska, a 19-year-old boy, so small he was the only one who fit inside the Sperry spherical turret that hung from the belly of the aircraft like a drop of metal. A position everyone considered the worst on the bomber because you were alone, face down, sealed, inside a plexiglass bubble at 40 degrees below zero, rotating 360 degrees, scanning for enemy fighters coming from below. And if the hydraulic mechanism of the turret failed, you could not get out, and if the plane went down, you could not reach your parachute. Novak was 19 years old and had a baby face that made the barmaids at the pub ask for his identification. And that made the base chaplain look at him with an expression of physical pain every time he saw him climb into the airplane. Your first mission was a daylight attack on a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt, a target that had already cost hundreds of lives in 2 previous missions that the 8th Air Force called strategic victories and that the crews called slaughters. You remember every second of that mission as if it were etched with acid on the inside of your skull. You remember the briefing at 4 in the morning in the Quonset hut that smelled of burnt coffee and tobacco, where the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain over the map, and the red ribbon marking the route stretched from Norfolk to the heart of Bavaria, and a collective murmur passed through the room like a seismic wave. You remember the breakfast of real eggs, not powdered, because real eggs were the signal that they expected significant casualties and wanted you to at least die with something decent in your stomach. You remember the walk to the flight line in the electrically heated flight suit that weighed 15 kilograms, and that was supposed to warm you through resistance wires connected to the aircraft's system, but that failed 30% of the time. And when it failed, frostbite was a matter of minutes, and you had heard stories of gunners who landed with fingers black as charcoal that the medics cut off with the same casualness with which a butcher cuts sausages. You remember the takeoff, the brutal weight of 4 tons of bombs in the belly of the aircraft that made the confessor need every centimeter of the runway to lift off the moment the wheels left the concrete and the English ground receded below you with an agonizing slowness, and the spiraling climb over an hour and a half while the 36 aircraft of the group assembled into the staggered combat box formation, a formation designed to maximize the defensive fire coverage of the 50 caliber machine guns, 13 per aircraft, 468 barrels pointing in every direction, like a steel porcupine flying at 320 kilometers per hour toward a place where other men were waiting to kill you. The first time you saw flak, you thought it was beautiful. It looked like black flowers opening in the blue sky, dark peonies blooming out of nothing, with an almost organic symmetry. And for 2 or 3 seconds, your brain processed the image as something aesthetic before the first explosion rocked the airplane with the force of a giant fist striking a tin can, and the plexiglass of the nose cracked 15 centimeters from your face, and the frozen air rushed in roaring like an animal. And you understood, with a clarity that burned through you as if someone had injected acid into your veins, that each of those black flowers was an 88mm shell fired by a Flak 36 cannon from the ground. That each shell weighed 9 kilograms and traveled at 800 meters per second, that its time fuse was set to detonate at your exact altitude, and that when it detonated, it hurled 1,500 fragments of hot steel across a radius of 200 meters, and that the German gunners fired in predicted boxes of fire, meaning they calculated your speed, your altitude, and your heading, and filled the space where you were going to be with a density of shrapnel that turned the sky into an industrial shredder. You flew through that shredder for 12 minutes that lasted 12 centuries. You saw the B-17 flying to your right, in the low position of the squadron, take a direct hit in the number 2 fuel tank on the left wing and become an orange fireball that disintegrated in the air like a paper model thrown into a fireplace. And of the 10 men aboard, you saw 2 parachutes emerge, only 2. 2 white mushrooms descending slowly toward a country that would receive them with barbed wire, and dogs and prisoner of war camps if they were lucky, and with a bullet in the back of the head if they were not. You did not have time to feel anything. The human brain, when operating under sustained mortal threat, deactivates the emotional circuits and transfers all resources to motor and perceptual processing. And that is exactly what you did. You deactivated everything that made you human, and became a calculating machine that looked through the Norden sight and adjusted the controls and waited for the release point with a concentration that excluded everything else. The fear, the cold, the noise, the screaming on the intercom, the smell of cordite and burned rubber, and something else that took you 3 missions to identify as the smell of human blood vaporized by an explosion. A sweet and ferrous smell that adheres to the inside of the oxygen mask and that you taste with every inhalation, like an obscene communion with death. You released your bombs over Schweinfurt at 11:42 in the morning. 12 general-purpose bombs of 225 kilograms each, loaded with a 60-40 Amatol mix that fell for 37 seconds, tracing ballistic arcs that your sight had calculated with a precision that in practice degraded due to wind, aircraft vibrations, operator stress, and the smoke from previous fires that obscured the target. And when you looked down through the plexiglass, you saw the explosions bloom on the ground like blisters on the skin of the earth, columns of gray and black smoke rising to form mushrooms that merged into a solid cloud that hid what you had done. And what you had done was destroy, according to the Post-Mission Damage Assessment Officer's report. Approximately 34% of the productive capacity of the Kugelfischer No. 2 plant, a moderate operational success that cost 7 aircraft from the group, 70 men, some dead, some captured, some missing. A category that meant their bodies were so fragmented or so buried under rubble that no one would ever find them. You returned to Thorpe Abbotts at 3 in the afternoon with 467 shrapnel holes in the Confessor's fuselage, the No. 3 engine operating at 60% power, the hydraulic system for the landing gear damaged, which forced Brennan to lower the wheels manually using the emergency pump, while DeWitt held the controls with both hands because the right aileron cable was 80% severed, and the airplane wanted to roll over on itself like a wounded animal. Kowalski had a shrapnel fragment embedded in his left thigh that bled through his flight trousers, forming a thick pool on the aluminum floor of the compartment. And Driscoll, the waist gunner from Minnesota, had taken a fragment to the right cheek that tore away a piece of flesh the size of a $50 coin, and that the flight surgeon stitched in the infirmary with 8 sutures, while Driscoll smoked a cigarette with his left hand and told jokes in a nasal voice because his jaw was swollen like a balloon. That night, in the hut, you sat on your cot and stared at the corrugated metal ceiling and listened to the English rain striking the metal in an irregular rhythm that sounded like distant applause, and you realized you felt nothing. Not fear, not relief, not guilt, not pride. Nothing. A clinical void that would have alarmed any psychiatrist, but that you interpreted as strength, as proof that you were the kind of man who could do this, who could fly into hell and come back and sit on a cot and not break. You did not yet understand that the nothing was not strength. It was the first symptom. The missions accumulated like notches in the frame of your cot, where you carved each one with a knife. 5th mission, railway marshalling yards at Ham. 6th, synthetic oil refinery at Merseburg, where the flak was so dense that Rabinowitz said you could step out of the airplane and walk on it. 7th, Focke-Wulf fighter assembly plants at Bremen. 8th, 9th, 10th. Each mission was a repetition of the same ritual. The briefing at 4 in the morning, the real eggs when they expected you to die, the takeoff in darkness, the frozen climb, the formation over the English Channel, the penetration into enemy airspace, the flak, the fighters, the bomb run, the release of the payload, the return, the landing, the whiskey they gave you in the debriefing room, dinner, silence, the cot, the ceiling, the rain, and between one mission and the next, the absences. Empty cots that appeared each week like pulled teeth in a jawbone. Lieutenant Morrison from Aircraft 6 missing over Berlin. Sergeant Phelps, tail gunner on Aircraft 12, killed by a burst of 20mm cannon fire from a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that came through the rear window and shattered his spinal column. Second Lieutenant Caruso, co-pilot on Aircraft 3, who survived 15 missions without a scratch and died on the 16th when an M50 incendiary bomb from the aircraft flying above them released prematurely and punched through his cockpit roof. Death was random, capricious, democratic in its indifference. It did not distinguish between the brave and the cowardly, between veterans and replacements, between those who prayed and those who cursed. You learned not to grow attached. You learned to call the replacements by their rank and not by their name. You learned to eat fast, to sleep light, to never lend books or borrow them, because a book lent to a dead man is a reminder you do not want on your shelf. On Mission 14, you lost Novak, the 19-year-old ball turret gunner from Nebraska with the baby face. A Focke-Wulf 190 attacked from 6 o'clock low, directly beneath the aircraft, and a burst of 20mm cannon fire perforated the spherical turret as though it were aluminum foil. When we landed and the ground crew opened the turret, what they found was not a body in any recognizable sense of the word. It was a mass of flesh and fabric and fused metal that the mechanics extracted with shovels and buckets, while 2 of them vomited at the side of the runway. The chaplain held a ceremony with a closed casket that weighed less than it should because they had not been able to recover everything. And you stood in the rain, listening to the words about resurrection and eternal life. And you thought, with a coldness that frightened you because you recognized it was no longer emotional anesthesia, but something more permanent, something more like an amputation, that Novak had been 19 years old and had never kissed a girl, and that his mother in Nebraska would receive a telegram that would say, "We regret to inform you," and that she would read it standing on the porch of a wheat farm, and that she would fall to her knees the way everyone falls, and that she would never know that not enough of her son remained to fill a casket. Starting from Mission 15, you began to count things. You counted the rivets in the wall of the hut. You counted the steps from your cot to the latrine. You counted the seconds between each flak burst. You counted the breaths in the oxygen mask. Counting was a way of not thinking, an arithmetic wall between you and the abyss that opened behind every uncontrolled thought. You also developed a tic in your left eyelid that appeared every time you heard the sound of an aircraft engine. And since you lived on an airbase where engines roared 18 hours a day, the tic was practically permanent. Henderson, the tail gunner from Alabama, developed a tremor in his hands that kept him from holding a coffee cup without spilling it. Callahan, the radio operator, stopped playing the clarinet because he said he could no longer feel his fingers, even though the doctors assured him there was no nerve damage. Brennan, the pilot, began praying the full rosary before every mission, all 5 mysteries, and if anyone interrupted him, he started over from the beginning with a compulsiveness that Rabinowitz, with his black Brooklyn humor, described as the Catholic version of war neurosis. None of us used those words. We said we were tired, that we needed a weekend pass to London, that a couple of days away from the base would fix us. But it was not tiredness, and London did not fix us. What was happening to us had no name in the military vocabulary of 1944. Decades later, they would call it post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, it was simply the war eating you from the inside, like an acid that dissolves first the ability to sleep, then the ability to feel, then the ability to remember who you were before it all began. Mission 21 was an area bombing raid on an industrial city whose name you have not forgotten, because that name became the border between the person you were before and the person you were after. The primary target was a synthetic fuel production plant on the outskirts, but the cloud cover was 10/10, completely overcast, which meant visual bombing was impossible, and you had to use the H2X navigation radar, a device that displayed terrain as green blotches on a black background, and that had a margin of error between 800 and 1200 meters, which meant your bombs could fall on the factory, or they could fall on the city center. And you knew it, and the pilot knew it, and the navigator knew it, and no one said anything, because the order was to bomb, and the order did not include a conscience clause. You released 48 M47 incendiary bombs, loaded with a mixture of jellied gasoline and oil that burned at 1200 degrees, and could not be extinguished with water. And as the aircraft banked for the return, you saw through a momentary gap in the clouds, an orange glow spreading across the surface like an oil slick in a puddle. A glow that was not a factory burning, but something much larger, something the size of a neighborhood, of an entire district. And you felt, for the first time in weeks, something that pierced through the arithmetic wall and the emotional anesthesia and the shell of nothing you had built around your conscience. You felt a weight in your chest that was not physical, that had no mass or volume, but that was more real than the bombs you had just released. A weight that was the belated and total comprehension that beneath that glow there were houses, and inside the houses there were people, and inside the people there were lives as complete and complex as your own. Lives with mothers who sewed dresses, and fathers who coughed from industrial dust, and red-haired girlfriends and little brothers. Who hunted squirrels and wooden porches where someone read letters, and you had erased them from the world with the same efficiency with which an accountant crosses a figure from a ledger. That night you did feel something. You felt nausea, and the nausea did not go away. You completed your 25 missions on a Thursday in July of 1944. The last was a tactical target in support of the Normandy invasion, a railway bridge in northern France that you destroyed with an accuracy of 31 meters that the assessment officer rated as excellent. You landed, climbed out of the aircraft, walked to the debriefing room, drank the whiskey, answered the questions, signed the form, and when you stepped outside into the fresh English afternoon air and felt the sun on your face and the grass under your boots and the sound of birds singing in the hedgerows as if there were no war in the world, you dropped to your knees on the wet grass and wept. You did not weep from relief or from joy or from grief. You wept because the valve you had sealed, shut for 6 months, burst open all at once, and everything you had blocked came out simultaneously like a breached dam. Novak in the turret, the orange glow beneath the clouds, the parachutes that never opened, the empty cots, the smell of blood in the oxygen mask, the faces of replacements whose names you never learned, the 1,500 fragments of each 88mm shell, the 48 incendiary bombs that burned at 1,200 degrees over a neighborhood whose name you repeat every night like an inverted litany, not to ask forgiveness, but to remember that forgiveness is something you cannot ask for, because you do not know whom to ask, because the people you should ask are ash. You returned to Decatur in August. Your mother waited for you at the bus station in a flower print dress, and with an embrace that smelled of your dead father's cologne, and that lasted so long, the bus driver had to honk the horn to get you to move from the door. The house was the same. The porch was the same. The corn in the fields was the same. But you were not the same, and the distance between the man who left and the man who returned is a distance not measured in kilometers, but in altitude. 7,600 meters of altitude, where you left something you will never recover. Call it innocence, or call it the ability to sleep without seeing black flowers opening on the inside of your eyelids. You got a job at the post office. You married a good woman named Dorothy, who was not Ruth Ann, and who was not anyone other than Dorothy. And that was enough. And you had 2 children who grew up in the same white wooden house your mother left you when she died in '51. You did not talk about the war. None of those who came back talked about the war. We stored the uniforms in boxes, the medals in drawers, the memories in a basement of the mind, whose door we bolted shut and whose key we threw down a Yiriki, Shro, Dedoritin, well so deep we believed no one would ever find it. But the key floats. It always floats. And it rises to the surface on stormy nights when the thunder sounds too much like flak, and on summer days when the smell of grilled meat from the neighbor's barbecue resembles too closely another smell you know, and in the moments of silence when there is nothing to count, no rivets, no steps, no breaths, and the abyss behind your thoughts opens like a Bombay door, and you fall, and you fall, and you fall for 37 seconds that never end, toward a ground that burns with an orange glow that cannot be extinguished with water, or with the years, or with the silence of an 83-year-old man sitting on a white wooden porch in Decatur, Illinois, who watches the empty sky and still counts, always counts, the seconds between one black flower and the next.